All right, so today we're going to walk through disconnecting the stator and the rectifier. And while this seems like an overwhelming process, if you have a little bit of wrenching skills, you should be able to manage through. If you aren't confident in your skills, then you probably want to just watch this video over a few times and then you'll get a little bit more comfortable with the process. So the way I'm going about this is that I've never gone through to remove the rectifier or the stator connectors. So I really wasn't sure how to tackle this, and I did research online. There wasn't a lot of things to look at as far as examples or tutorials. So I just went the full process that I thought was correct in getting to this item and being able to back out the wires and being able to disconnect things without being overly frustrated because I missed a step or I tried to find an easy way out. So some of those lengthy steps that I'm referring to is that I'm going to have to take off some bodywork. I'm going to have to release the muffler, release the shock, remove the seat, remove the battery, remove the tank, remove the throttle body assembly, the airbox. And there's going to be a lot of wiring and a sub harness to remove. So this is just a lot of the things that we're going to get through this. So like I said, it's very manageable, so don't get stressed out about it. Now that we've gotten through all the yada yada, let's get started. So this is going to be one of the easier things to do, and I'm sure you've done this before if you've done any maintenance on your bike. We're just going to remove the belly pan. So first we'll start off by releasing the 4 bolts that hold the belly pan on. These are 5mm hex screws. So we'll just take these out one by one. So unfortunately on the other side, when I was taking up the screws, I forgot to turn on the camera. So you missed all that riveting action, but let's move on. So the muffler is the next thing we need to remove. It should be the same for my competition works as an OEM. There's only 2 points of contact for that. So one of those points is down below behind the heat shield, and it's just after the catalytic converter. This is a C-clamp. And the other connection is going to be out by the rear set. So if your setup is a little bit different than what I have here, you'll just need to refer back to your owner's manual for your particular muffler and then remove that from the bike. So now that we've released all the retaining bolts for the muffler, we can just set that aside. At this point in time, I'm just trying to illustrate why I'm taking off the rear shock, because there is such little space back here to work with. You could get to the bolts that the rectifier sits on. It sits on a bracket, so there's 2 bolts that are accessible. There's one behind the shock that's a little bit harder to get to, and there's one on the clutch side of the bike that you can get to relatively easily. But for me, I just wanted to go ahead and just push the shock back so I'd have as much room as possible disconnecting things and pulling things apart. Again, if you do your own assessment and you feel like you don't need to, then you can go ahead and skip forward. So at this point, we need to support the bike. My bike is already on its front and rear stand, so I'm going to use a floor jack to raise the bike up ever so slightly so that I can slide a floor jack in this little cutout that's just adjacent to the dog bone. And then once I have that settled, I'll lower the floor jack and the bike should be suspended. Not gonna lie, didn't really think that through the way I lifted the bike up on its front and rear stand, because as I started to lift the bike, the front stand started to get a little bit lighter, so it started to rock just ever so slightly. So if you do have a friend around, they will be able to hold the bike in place as you lift the bike up with a little bit more stability. But it's manageable, but it gets a little sketchy. So we're just going to give ourselves a little bit more extra room by removing the rear hugger and just go ahead and remove the chain guard so that when we release the shock, we can just lean it against the swing arm. If we never remove the rear hugger, there are 3 fasteners that hold it in place, and these are torque fasteners. There's 2 on the clutch side of the bike, and there's another one on the engine side of the bike that's underneath the chain. It's kind of hidden, but it's still pretty easy to get to. So with the hugger out of the way, this will give us access to the bolt that's hidden underneath that one, and then there's another bolt which is visible on the swing arm. So we'll just take these 2 off. I believe they're 5 or 6 millimeter hex screws. Here I'm just showing you the fasteners for the rear shock. It's held on by a bolt, and then on the other side it's a hex fastener. So with the long socket and wrench on one side and then a hex key on the other, we'll just release and remove the fasteners for the shock. With all the fasteners now released, we can just let the shock rest on the swing arm. With the rear shock out of the way, we have better access to the rectifier bracket bolts. On this side, you can see this one's super easy to get to, and we'll remove this one first. Back on the other side, I'm going to give myself a little bit more ease of access by removing the master cylinder. Just be careful when you take off your master cylinder that you just don't lay it down to the side, because you may allow air bubbles to get into your brake line. I had to bleed my brakes anyway, so I wasn't too worried about it. With everything removed, we now have access to the last bolt for the rectifier bracket. Once we remove this, we can just slide the rectifier a little bit forward, and then we can release the multi-plugs that hold it in place. So the next item we need to do is remove the battery. So grab a key, unlock it, remove the seat, put that to the side. And with the battery exposed, we can now disconnect the retaining band and then remove the negative terminal first, and then remove the positive. Now we can move on to removing the tank. There are 2 fasteners at the top of the tank that hold it in, and we'll remove these next. After I've put those 2 bolts aside, I'm going to suspend the tank. Underneath the tank, there lies the evap lines, the connectors to your fuel pump, and the fuel line itself. I know that this is not the best vantage point to have, so if you're looking at your own bike, you'll have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. But as I'm trying to demonstrate, the wires that disconnect from the rectifier need to work their way back toward the stator, and these wires are underneath other wires, other brackets, so it's just going to take a little bit more time to try to finagle this, and then you'll find out that you'll catch a part where you're not able to pull the connector out. So you will have to eventually take all this stuff out, because the crank position sensor that comes from the stator is connected to the starter motor on a harness. So unless you have other tools or small tools that allow you to disconnect those things, it will still be a pain in the butt. Before I fully take the tank off, I decided to go ahead and take the opportunity to walk back the rectifier connector, and once I got that done, I also decided to go ahead and loosen the bolt that holds a lot of the grounds for certain things, and it had a few more connections to it. So I went ahead and released that, moved the wires out of the way, and then I put the bolt back so I won't lose it. With the tank still suspended, we can now move on to releasing all the hoses and the clips and the main fuel line. The fuel pump connectors are just held on by clips. You just hold the tabs, then they pop off. The hoses are pretty easy to take off. You just wiggle them back and they'll slide off. The fuel line has a little bit of a weird connector, so you'll have to release it by pulling back the orange tab. It'll release the two prongs, and then you'll pull back on the black connection, and you just want to easily walk that back off. It will be a little snug, so just give it a little bit time and don't do anything too silly because you might break it. So with all the connections and fuel line taken off, I'm just going to cap off the main fuel line because I know I still have gas in the tank and I don't want any other fuel to dribble out. There's only one retaining bolt left. It's a longer bolt and it's only threaded on one side of the subframe. So as you start to release the bolt, it'll start to spin after a certain point. So you can just grab a pair of needle nose pliers and pull the bolt out. There's also a sleeve that's in there that may not come out with the bolt. So once you remove the bolt, just pull out the sleeve as well. So now that we have the bolt removed, we can just lift the tank up and set it aside. Be sure to prop up the tank when you lay it down because the fuel line is plastic, and if you lean it on something or you just put something on top of the tank, it may crush it and snap it, so it's something you want to be aware of. Before we move on, I'm going to take a second just to go ahead and walk back the connection to the stator. And on the stator side, there's also this plastic cover that will allow us to have more access to all the wires and just a little bit more visibility of what's going on. So we'll remove that in a second. So with this plastic cover, I've removed it before, and it has two fasteners and a zip tie that holds it in place. One fastener is plastic, and I accidentally broke it from a previous project. I thought it was a rivet type fastener, but it's actually a Phillips head plastic one. The other is a lock nut that's hard to access, and it's actually hard to show with the camera, so you'll see what I'm saying once you get to this point. But if you have a ratchet wrench, it works really well. The process of getting it off just takes a second. So now with the plastic cover removed, you can see how much more access we have to the additional wires. It doesn't really help us remove anything, it just allows us to see more once we start, pulling wires through. In my air filter video, I got a little bit more in depth about removing the upper assembly of the airbox, but for the purpose of time, I'm just going to keep this a little bit short. One of the first things we're going to do is remove the IOT sensor from its connector. Now, remove the 8mm screws around the airbox. Some fasteners are under the ECU harness, including a torque screw holding another connector to the airbox. Rotate the upper assembly carefully as the immobilizer remains attached. Using a pick, you can disengage the connector from the metal bracket. And unplug the immobilizer. Set the upper assembly aside. Next, remove the velocity stacks. Each velocity stack is secured by 2 hex fasteners. Then, remove the main bolt. When removing this bolt, ensure not to lift up on the lower assembly too high. There are two hoses, one black hose on the right secured by a clamp, and one gray hose on the left which does not have a clamp. A bit earlier, I quickly just disengaged the shift linkage from the shifter arm, so that way I could remove the plastic cover we were trying to get to. And now when dealing with the quick shifter or your shift linkage, every setup will vary. You may not need to remove as many components as I do. Therefore, you can move forward if this does not apply to you. So at this point, I'm just gonna go ahead and disassemble my setup. We can disconnect the 3 fuel injector multi-plugs from underneath the fuel rail. They release pretty easily, so just take them off and just set them aside. So next on our list is we need to release the throttle cables. To remove the throttle cable assembly, we need to release the throttle cables from the throttle cam. At the throttle cable housing, there are 2 Phillips screws we need to remove. These screws are on the back of the housing. Once the housing is open, you can release the cables by pushing the cable ends out of the holding slots with the pick. And then you can put the housing aside. So now we can release the cables from the cam bracket connected to the throttle body assembly. These are held on by 8mm retaining jam nuts. Just like before, once the cables are released, you can use a pick to push the cable ends out. So at the part we were doing the injector plugs and releasing them, I forgot to mention that there is one more connection along that fuel injector wiring line. It's to the throttle position sensor on the right side of the assembly. So we can just go ahead and disconnect that now. The video may not show it clearly, but this illustration highlights the 3 retaining clamps securing the throttle body assembly. The left and the right fasteners are accessible with a standard hex key. For the center fastener, you'll need an extra long hex key or an extension. Now gently rock the assembly back and forth while applying upward force to release it from the intake holes. After detachment, unplug the evap emission hoses. The main fuel line can be left connected or removed. The final thing we need to do at this point is cover up the intake holes. We don't want anything falling into the engine at this point. After removing the throttle body assembly, access to the crank position sensor becomes clearer. However, some sub-harnesses, bolts, and connections still need to be undone. The crank position sensor is located at the bottom, harnessed to the starter. Though the camera angle isn't ideal, you'll get a better understanding what I'm removing as you follow along. Several connections will need to be undone, which I'll demonstrate. With the plugs out of the way, we can see a retaining bolt for the harness that needs to be removed, so that way we can reroute the stator connection during reinstallation. Use a pick to release the crank position sensor from its harness and disconnect the plug. Then work on threading the stator connection through the hot mess of engineering. With both connections free, we can easily pull them through the engine side opening. So I usually make new templates from gaskets in order to keep track of the bolts. Have an oil pan ready for slight oil spillage when opening the engine cover. Begin by removing the engine cover bolts. There is no specific sequence for releasing the bolts. One of the bolts has a copper washer on it. Once all the bolts are out, remove the magnetized cover by applying equal pressure. When removing the cover, the idler gear and the shaft may come off too. Take your time and then reassemble them and put them back carefully without rotating the gears. Usually, you would replace the gasket. However, mine is relatively new after replacing the cover from a low side on the track. Since it's undamaged, I'll go ahead and reuse it. Removing the stator from the engine cover is a straightforward process. There are 3 main hex bolts securing the stator, 1 small hex bolt for the wire retainer, and 2 small hex retainer bolts for the crank position sensor. Once all the bolts are removed, the stator assembly can be pulled out easily. So, when replacing components, opting for OEM parts is always an option. in many instances, it makes sense to invest in these higher priced items. However, there are viable alternatives for certain components. I have chosen to use replacement parts from Rick's Motorsports. For full disclosure, neither I nor this video has received any sponsorship. It should be noted that the product may differ slightly from the OEM. To install the new stator, position it within the cover and ensure the wire grommet is correctly aligned with the engine cover slot. There is a dedicated channel for the crank position wire. Gently guide it into place using your finger or a plastic trim tool. To secure all the components and prevent movement, install the wire retainer next. Apply blue Loctite 243, which is oil tolerant, to the retainer bolts. Once the retainer is fixed, proceed to reinstall the remaining hex bolts. Ensure proper torque applications. Stator bolts should be torqued to about 12 Nm, while both the crank position sensor bolts and the retainer bolts require a torque of 6 Nm. To replace the rectifier, remove the old one from the bracket and install the new one. A lithium compatible rectifier was chosen this time because I went with a show ride battery on the bike. After reinstalling all necessary items onto the engine cover, the assembly can be reinstalled. When installing the cover, note that it may snap together because of the magnets. Keep the alignment as precise as possible to ensure proper fitment with the case and the gasket. Once the case is on, visually check that the gasket is properly seated. Replace the retainer bolts in a star pattern. After each bolt is hand tightened, torque the bolts to 8 Nm. For future maintenance, don't restore the wiring to its original position. The stator wire ran between the harness bracket and the engine, so if you return it to the OEM setup, you'll need to undo the harness again. Instead, reroute the wire to avoid the disassembly next time. Same applies to the crank position sensor. Don't attach it back to the starter harness. You can simply zip tie it to another wire loom for easier access next time. There's always a point in the process where you realize you could have done something sooner to help yourself out. So here I am trying to explain, if you just remove this 3-wire harness, you can get more visibility in looking down at the crank position sensor. So engineers 1, me 0. Now, reattach all the connection plugs and bracket bolt. Then guide the stator connection back towards the rectifier location. So in order to reinstall the rectifier and its bracket, we just need to move the rear shock to create a little bit more space. Refit the rectifier back into place and tighten the bolts for the bracket. Apply a small amount of dielectric grease for the electrical connections. Once grease is applied, reconnect the components to the rectifier. Finally, secure the shock back in place and refit any other necessary items. Ensure all bolts are tightened and torqued as needed. If you followed me through the process, congratulations. I know this seems like a bit of overkill in order to get to these components, but when I started looking through and trying to find a cheat or a faster way, I really didn't find one. And some of the stuff I had already done before in different projects, so it wasn't as daunting to me. But if you get a little discouraged from this, watch the video thoroughly. At least it gives you an A to B. But if you happen to go through and you find things that you can do slightly quicker, or you found a little trick or a tip, feel free to drop those in the comments and help other viewers sidebar all this other extra work. I hope you found this episode helpful. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next one.